Jack Thornton's stomach was empty, and his pockets held exactly $3 when he bought the Albino Colt that grown men refused to go near. The white animal shaking in the corner of that dusty pen was going to either save his life or end it, and he had no way of knowing which until it was far too late. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust from the auction yard settled into every crease of Jack Thornton's worn denim jacket as he counted the coins in his palm for the third time, 3 silver dollars and handful of pennies. It was all that remained of his father's legacy, all that stood between him and complete destitution in the unforgiving landscape of 1887 Texas. The sun beat down mercilessly on the livestock pens where ranchers with deep pockets and confident swagger examined prime horseflesh, their voices carrying across the yard with the easy authority of men who had never known true want. Jack stood at the edge of the crowd, his 24 years weighing heavily on shoulders that had carried too much responsibility too soon. 6 months ago, he had buried his father on a windswept hill overlooking the small plot of land they had called home. William Thornton had been a dreamer, a man who saw potential where others saw only hardship, and that optimism had ultimately killed him. He had invested everything in a cattle drive that ended in disaster when a late-season storm scattered the herd across 3 counties. The loss had broken something fundamental inside him, and 3 weeks later his heart had simply stopped beating, as if it had finally given up trying to sustain hope in a world that seemed determined to crush it. The ranch, if you could even call it that, consisted of 40 acres of stubborn Texas soil that refused to yield anything but tumbleweeds and disappointment. The house was more gap than wall, the barn listed dangerously to one side, and the well had run dry 2 summers ago. Jack had tried to sell it, but no one wanted land that came with more problems than possibilities. So here he stood, at the Henderson County livestock auction, with $3 to his name, and a desperate plan that everyone who knew him would call foolish. He needed a horse, not just any horse, but breeding stock, something he could build a future around. His father had always said that good bloodlines could transform a failing ranch into a prosperous one, that patience and careful selection would eventually pay dividends. Jack clung to that wisdom, like a drowning man clutching driftwood, because it was all he had left of his father's dreams. The auctioneer's voice rose above the general din of the crowd, announcing the next lot with practiced enthusiasm. A magnificent bay stallion pranced into the ring, its coat gleaming like polished mahogany, muscles rippling beneath perfectly conditioned flesh. The bidding started at $50 and quickly climbed higher. Jack watched with the hollow feeling of a man looking through a window at a world he could never enter. That horse would fetch $200 easily, maybe more. It might as well have been $1,000. He turned to leave, defeated before he had even tried, when a commotion near the back pens caught his attention. A group of ranch hands were laughing, pointing at something in one of the smaller holding areas. Curiosity drew Jack closer, though he suspected he was just delaying the inevitable walk back to his wagon and the long, lonely ride home to a ranch that was slowly returning to the wild Texas prairie it had been carved from. What he saw in that pen made his breath catch in his throat. A colt, no more than 6 months old, stood pressed against the far corner, its coat a startling pure white that seemed to glow in the harsh sunlight. But it was not the color that held Jack's attention. It was the way the animal held itself, head high despite the obvious fear in its pink-rimmed eyes, legs planted firm even as its whole body trembled with nervous energy. There was something about the set of its shoulders, the arch of its neck that spoke of breeding far beyond what should have ended up in a back pen at a county auction. "That's the defective one," a gravelly voice said beside him. Jack turned to find old Luther Hawkins, a horse trader who had been working auctions since before Jack was born. Owner tried to sell it private first, but nobody wants an albino. Bad luck, they say. Weak constitution, poor eyesight, won't live past 2 years old. Plus, it's mean. Kicked 2 handlers already today. Jack studied the colt more carefully. Its eyes, while pink, were bright and alert. Its legs, though trembling, were straight and strong. The trembling, he realized, was not from weakness, but from barely contained energy, like a coiled spring waiting to release. This was not a sickly animal. This was a spirited one that had been mishandled and misunderstood. "What's it gonna bring?" Jack asked, trying to keep the interest out of his voice. Luther spat tobacco juice into the dust and shrugged. "Probably nothing. Might end up going to the glue factory if nobody takes it. Owner just wants it gone. Says it's been nothing but trouble since it was foaled." The auction for the bay stallion concluded with a final hammer strike at $230, and the crowd began to disperse, some heading toward the payment office, others moving to examine the next group of animals being brought forward. Jack watched the colt in the back pen, watched the way it tracked every movement around it with intelligent eyes, the way its ears swiveled to catch every sound. His father's voice echoed in his memory, words spoken 100 times over the years. Sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as problems that scare everyone else away. The auctioneer was bringing forward a milk cow when Jack made his way to the office. The clerk barely looked up from his ledger when Jack cleared his throat. "The white colt in the back pen," Jack said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What's the minimum bid?" The clerk glanced up with a mix of surprise and amusement. "That one? Owner said he'd take $3 just to be rid of it. You interested?" $3. Exactly what Jack had in his pocket. It felt like fate, or perhaps just the universe's final cruel joke on the Thornton family. "I'll take it," he said before he could change his mind. The clerk's eyebrows rose. "You sure about that, son? That animal's got a reputation. Besides the color being bad luck, it's never been properly broke. Might not even be worth the rope to lead it home." Jack thought about his father, buried on that windswept hill, thought about the empty barn and the dreams that had died with the man who dreamed them, thought about having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. "I'm sure," he said, and pushed his $3 silver across the counter. The walk from the payment office to the back pen felt longer than it should have. Jack could feel eyes on him, hear the whispers that followed in his wake. "That's William Thornton's boy," someone muttered. "Heard he's broke as a church mouse. Now he's buying the cursed colt. Must have lost his mind along with his money." Jack kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his jaw set in a hard line that his father would have recognized. Pride was sometimes all a poor man had, and Jack wore his like armor against the judgment of men who measured worth in dollars and acres. The colt watched his approach with those unsettling pink eyes, its white coat now streaked with dust from the pen. Up close, Jack could see the delicate tracery of veins beneath the pale skin, the way sunlight seemed to pass through the translucent edges of its ears. It was beautiful in a strange, otherworldly way, like something that had wandered out of a dream and found itself trapped in the harsh reality of a Texas auction yard. Luther Hawkins was leaning against the pen fence, shaking his head slowly. "You really going through with this, boy? That $3 could buy you a month's worth of supplies, maybe some seed for spring planting." "It could," Jack agreed, reaching the fence and studying the colt carefully. "Or it could buy me the start of something better." "That thing's never going to amount to anything," Luther insisted, though his voice held more concern than mockery. "Look at it. Scared of its own shadow, mean as a snake when cornered. And that color, every rancher in Texas knows albinos don't last. Weak blood, can't take the sun, go blind before they're 5 years old. It's throwing good money after bad." Jack climbed onto the fence rail, moving slowly and deliberately. The colt's ears flicked backward, its body tensing for flight or fight. "My father used to say that sometimes what everyone knows for certain is just fear dressed up as wisdom. Jack said quietly. He said the best horses he ever owned were the ones other people were too scared or too proud to take a chance on. Your father also died broke, Luther said bluntly, then immediately looked regretful. I'm sorry, son. That was unkind. I'm just trying to save you from making another mistake. Jack nodded, accepting the apology. Luther was right after all. His father had died with nothing to show for a lifetime of hard work and eternal optimism, but he had also died believing that tomorrow might bring something better, that the next horse, the next season, the next opportunity might be the one that changed everything. Maybe that hope was foolish, but it was better than the alternative of giving up entirely. He dropped down into the pen, and the colt immediately retreated to the far corner, nostrils flaring, body coiled tight. Jack stood still, letting the animal take his measure. He could see the fear in those strange eyes, but also something else: intelligence, awareness. This was not a stupid or damaged animal. It was a frightened one, probably mishandled from birth, treated as an oddity rather than a living creature with feelings and needs. Easy now, Jack said softly, making no move to approach. Nobody's going to hurt you. Not anymore. The colt's ears swiveled forward slightly, tracking the sound of his voice. Jack had grown up around horses, had learned from his father that patience was worth more than force, that trust had to be earned, not demanded. He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, just talking in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, about the weather, about his father, about the ranch that waited for them both, empty and hopeful at the same time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the colt's trembling began to ease. Its head lowered slightly, no longer poised for immediate flight. Jack took a single step forward, then stopped. The colt tensed, but did not bolt. Another step, another pause. It took nearly 20 minutes to cross the small pen, but finally Jack stood close enough to reach out, though he kept his hands at his sides. You're going to come home with me, he told the colt quietly, and I'm going to prove every single person wrong about you, about both of us. Outside the pen, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of someone actually trying to handle the notorious white colt. Jack ignored them, focused entirely on the animal before him. He raised his hand slowly, telegraphing every movement, and the colt's eyes tracked it with laser focus. When his palm finally made contact with the soft muzzle, the colt flinched, but did not pull away. There you are, Jack whispered. That's it. We're going to be partners, you and me. Luther appeared at the pen fence with a lead rope, which he handed over with obvious skepticism. You're going to need this, though I'll be surprised if you make it out of the pen without getting kicked. But the colt stood still as Jack slipped the rope around its neck, moving with practiced ease born of years working with his father's horses. The animal trembled beneath his touch, but there was none of the violence that had been promised. Just fear and confusion, and maybe, just maybe, a small spark of hope that this human might be different from the others. Leading the colt out of the pen felt like a small victory. The crowd parted to let them through, some people shaking their heads in disapproval, others watching with open curiosity. The colt walked beside Jack with jerky, nervous steps, its head high and alert, but it did not fight the rope. It did not kick or rear. It simply walked, one uncertain step at a time, toward whatever future awaited it. Jack's wagon sat at the edge of the auction yard, its wooden sides weathered and splintered. He had tied it to a hitching post that morning with the vague hope that he might have something to load into it by day's end. He had not imagined it would be this, a supposedly cursed albino colt that everyone else had rejected. But as he tied the lead rope securely to the wagon's side and climbed up onto the driver's seat, he felt something he had not experienced in months. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close to it. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, his luck was finally about to change. The journey back to the ranch took most of the afternoon, following rutted trails that wound through mesquite-dotted hills and across dry creek beds that had not seen water since early spring. Jack's old mare, Sadie, plodded along with patient resignation, seemingly unbothered by the white colt that trotted nervously behind the wagon. The colt balked at first when they started moving, planting its feet and pulling against the rope with sudden panic. Jack had stopped the wagon immediately, climbed down, and spent another 20 minutes just standing with the animal, talking in that same low, steady voice until the trembling subsided. Now, 3 hours into the journey, the colt had found a rhythm, matching its pace to Sadie's unhurried gait. Jack glanced back frequently, watching the way the animal moved. Despite its fear and obvious lack of proper handling, there was an elegance to its movement that spoke of good breeding. Its legs were long and straight, its chest deep, its hindquarters powerful. Whatever its lineage, someone had started with quality stock before deciding the albino coloring made it worthless. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Jack noticed the colt squinting against the brightness, its pink eyes clearly sensitive to the harsh Texas light. That at least matched what people said about albinos. But sensitivity was not the same as weakness, and Jack had already decided that most of what people said about this animal was based on superstition rather than observation. They passed several other ranches on the way home, sprawling spreads with painted fences and fat cattle grazing in irrigated pastures. Jack tried not to feel the familiar ache of envy that rose in his chest whenever he saw these places. The owners would be inside their substantial houses now, escaping the heat, planning their next cattle purchase or discussing breeding programs over cold drinks. They would never understand what it felt like to count your last $3 and gamble them on something everyone else called cursed. By the time they turned onto the overgrown track that led to the Thornton place, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and amber. The ranch came into view gradually, emerging from the landscape like something trying to hide its own shame. The house stood crooked and weathered, its front porch sagging in the middle where termites had weakened the support beams. The barn, which his father had built with his own hands 20 years ago, leaned dramatically to the left, held upright more by habit than structural integrity. The corrals were a patchwork of mismatched wood, some sections barely held together with rusted wire. Jack felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders as he surveyed his inheritance. This was what 3 generations of Thornton dreams had amounted to, 40 acres of stubborn land and buildings that were slowly surrendering to the relentless Texas elements. His grandfather had claimed this land during the homestead boom, believing that hard work and determination could transform raw prairie into prosperity. His father had inherited that belief along with the land, spending his life chasing that prosperity only to die with it still out of reach. He pulled the wagon to a stop beside the barn and sat for a moment, gathering his strength for what came next. The colt stood behind the wagon, its white coat now gray with trail dust, looking around at its new home with those unsettling pink eyes. Jack wondered what the animal saw, whether it recognized this place for what it was, a last chance for both of them. Climbing down from the wagon, Jack led the colt toward the barn. The building groaned in protest as he pushed open the heavy door, revealing the dim interior. Shafts of light penetrated through gaps in the walls, creating patterns on the dirt floor. There were 4 stalls, though only one still had an intact door. The others had been cannibalized over the years, their wood used for emergency repairs elsewhere, but one stall would be enough. It would have to be. He led the colt inside, moving slowly, letting the animal adjust to the dimmer light. The sensitivity that made bright sunlight painful seemed to work in reverse here. The colt's body relaxed slightly in the softer illumination, its breathing slowing from the rapid, nervous panting it had maintained throughout the journey. Jack secured the animal in the intact stall, making sure it had room to move, but could not escape or injure itself. There was no feed. That realization hit Jack like a physical blow as he stared at the empty feed bin. He had been so focused on acquiring the horse that he had not thought through the practical reality of keeping it alive. He had no hay, no grain, no money to purchase either. The pasture was sparse and dry, barely enough to sustain Sadie. Adding another animal, especially a young one that needed good nutrition to grow, was going to strain resources that were already stretched to breaking. Jack walked back outside and stared at the 40 acres that surrounded his failing ranch. In the fading light, he could see patches of prairie grass that had survived the dry summer. It was not much, but it would have to do. He would let the colt graze for a few hours each morning and evening when the sun was less intense. During the heat of the day, it could rest in the barn shade. It was not an ideal situation, but ideal had never been an option for the Thorntons. He spent the next hour hauling water from the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his property. The creek was barely a trickle now, but it was still flowing, which was more than could be said for many of the streams in the area. He filled a trough in the colt's stall and another for Sadie, his arms aching by the time he finished. When he finally stood back and watched the colt drink deeply, he felt a small surge of satisfaction. The animal was here. It was safe. It was his. That night, Jack sat on his crooked front porch with a plate of beans and hardtack, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. From inside the barn came the occasional sound of the colt moving in its stall, settling into its new home. The sounds were comforting somehow, proof that he was not entirely alone on this failing ranch. His father's journal sat beside him on the porch, its leather cover cracked and worn. William Thornton had kept meticulous records of every horse he had ever owned, every breeding decision, every success and failure. Jack opened it to a random page and read by the light of a small lantern. "The greatest horses are not born great," his father had written. "They become great when they find the right partner, someone who sees their potential and has the patience to nurture it. Bloodlines matter, but belief matters more." Jack closed the journal and looked toward the barn where the white colt rested. Everyone who saw that animal believed it was worthless, that its color was a curse rather than just a variation. But Jack had learned something from his father's lifetime of failures and small victories. Sometimes the things everyone else rejected were simply waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to see them differently. The first week with the colt nearly broke Jack's resolve. The animal refused to be touched beyond the initial brief contact at the auction yard, shying away whenever Jack entered the stall, pressing itself into the far corner with wide, fearful eyes. It would not eat when he was present, waiting until he left the barn before approaching the sparse grass he had cut and carried in from the pasture. At night, Jack could hear it pacing in the stall, restless and anxious, the sound of its hooves on the dirt floor a constant reminder of his $3 gamble. On the third morning, Jack woke before dawn and made his way to the barn in the gray pre-dawn light. He carried no rope, no halter, nothing that might signal his intention to control or dominate. He simply entered the stall and sat down in the far corner, his back against the rough wooden wall, and waited. The colt watched him with suspicious eyes, its body tense and ready to flee despite having nowhere to go. Jack did not speak, did not move. He simply sat there as the sun rose and light began to filter through the gaps in the barn walls, creating those familiar patterns on the dirt floor. He watched the colt and the colt watched him, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the animal's breathing began to slow. Its ears, which had been pinned flat against its head, gradually swiveled forward. After an hour, it took a single step closer, then another. This became their morning routine. Jack would enter the stall, sit in his corner, and wait. Sometimes the colt would eventually approach within a few feet. Other times it would maintain its distance, content to simply coexist in the same space. Jack never pushed, never demanded. He had time, and more importantly, he had nowhere else to be. The ranch work could wait. The failing fences and leaking roof could wait. This fragile trust could not. By the end of the first week, the colt would eat while Jack sat in the stall. By the end of the second week, it would approach close enough for him to smell the sweet scent of its breath. By the third week, it allowed his touch, flinching at first but gradually accepting his hand on its neck, its shoulder, its face. The name came to him one evening as he watched the colt grazing in the small pasture, its white coat luminous in the fading light. Ghost. It fit perfectly, this pale apparition that everyone believed should not exist, that moved through the world like something not quite real. When he called the name softly, the colt's ears swiveled toward him, and Jack took it as acceptance. But trust and training were two different challenges, and Jack soon discovered that Ghost had a mind as strong as its body. The colt was intelligent, dangerously so, learning quickly but also testing boundaries constantly. When Jack tried to introduce a saddle blanket, Ghost bolted to the far side of the pasture and refused to approach for the rest of the day. When he attempted to pick up a hoof to check for stones, Ghost pulled away with such force that Jack nearly lost his balance. Money remained a constant specter hanging over everything. Jack had nothing left after purchasing Ghost, and the ranch provided no income. He survived on beans and the occasional rabbit he could trap, rationing his supplies with the grim calculation of a man who knew exactly how many meals stood between him and starvation. Ghost fared slightly better, grazing on the sparse pasture grass and the hay Jack cut by hand from the small meadow near the creek. But neither of them was thriving. 3 weeks after bringing Ghost home, Jack received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Hadley owned the sprawling Circle H ranch that bordered the Thornton property to the north. He was a man in his 50s, weathered and successful, with the confident bearing of someone who had built something substantial in this harsh country. He rode up to Jack's crooked house on a magnificent chestnut gelding, his expensive saddle creaking as he dismounted. "Thornton," Hadley said with a nod, his eyes surveying the rundown property with barely concealed pity. "Heard you bought that albino colt at the auction last month." Jack felt his back stiffen defensively. News travels fast. Always does in ranch country. Hadley pulled off his leather gloves and tucked them into his belt. "I'll get straight to the point. That land of yours borders my eastern pasture. I need it for expansion, and you need money to survive. I'll give you $500 for the 40 acres. That's more than fair for land that's barely productive." $500. It was a fortune to Jack, more money than he had seen in his entire life. With that amount, he could start over somewhere else, maybe find work on an established ranch, build a new life without the crushing weight of his father's failed dreams. It was the practical choice, the sensible choice, the choice that anyone with half a brain would make without hesitation. "The land's not for sale," Jack heard himself say. Hadley's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Son, be reasonable. You're living on beans and hope out here. That colt you bought, everyone knows it's defective. You've got no breeding stock, no cattle, no income. What exactly are you planning to do with 40 acres of hardscrabble and a cursed horse?" "Build something," Jack replied, though even to his own ears it sounded absurd. "My grandfather claimed this land. My father worked it his whole life. I'm not giving up on it yet." "Pride's a poor substitute for food." Hadley's voice was not unkind, just pragmatic. "I'm offering you a chance to walk away with dignity and enough money to make a fresh start. Think about it. The offer stands for 1 month." After Hadley rode away, Jack walked out to the pasture where Ghost was grazing in the early evening light. The colt looked up at his approach, no longer fleeing but watching with alert curiosity. In 3 weeks they had built something fragile but real between them. Trust, maybe. Partnership, possibly. Jack had no idea if this animal would ever be worth anything, if the superstitions about albinos were true. if he had thrown away his last $3 on a doomed creature. But as Ghost walked over to him, allowing Jack to rest his hand on the smooth white neck, he knew he could not sell the land. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance, however small, that his father had been right about something. That patience and belief could transform rejection into something valuable. The breakthrough came on a sweltering August morning when Jack was repairing the corral fence, sweat dripping into his eyes as he hammered bent nails back into place. Ghost had been following him around the property for the past hour, maintaining a distance of about 10 feet, curious but cautious. Jack had grown accustomed to this shadow, this pale presence that tracked his movements with intelligent pink eyes. He was reaching for another board when he heard a distinctive rattling sound that made his blood run cold. The rattlesnake was coiled near the fence post, barely 3 feet from where Jack had been about to place his hand. It was a big one, thick as a man's wrist, its diamond-patterned scales dusty in the Texas heat. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat, knowing that any sudden movement might trigger a strike. What happened next occurred so quickly that Jack barely had time to process it. Ghost exploded forward with a speed that seemed impossible for a young horse, positioning itself between Jack and the snake. The colt's hooves struck the ground in a pattern that seemed almost like a dance, fast and precise, driving the rattlesnake back. Within seconds, the snake was dead, crushed beneath Ghost's flashing hooves, and the danger was over. Jack stood there, his heart hammering, staring at the colt that had just saved his life. Ghost was breathing hard, its nostrils flared, its body still tense with adrenaline. But its eyes were fixed on Jack, checking to make sure he was unharmed. In that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. This was no longer just a man trying to train a difficult horse. This was a partnership forged in mutual protection and growing affection. "Easy, boy," Jack said softly, approaching slowly. "Easy now. You saved my life." For the first time, Ghost did not shy away from sustained contact. Jack ran his hands over the trembling body, checking for any sign of injury, finding none. The colt leaned into his touch, seeming to draw comfort from the physical connection. They stood there together in the blazing sun, man and horse, bound now by something deeper than ownership. That afternoon, Jack managed to get a saddle blanket on Ghost's back. The colt tensed but did not bolt, trusting that Jack would not hurt it. By evening, Jack had introduced a lightweight saddle, cinching it loosely and letting Ghost wear it while grazing. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but it was real. Ghost was learning, and more importantly, Ghost was choosing to learn because it trusted the man who had taken a chance on it. Word of Jack's progress with the supposedly untrainable Albino Colt began to spread through the ranching community. Luther Hawkins rode out one afternoon, ostensibly to check on some cattle that had strayed near the property line, but really to see if the rumors were true. He found Jack working Ghost in the small corral, the colt responding to voice commands and subtle pressure from the lead rope. "I'll be damned," Luther said, settling against the fence rail. "That's the same animal that kicked 2 handlers at the auction?" "Same one," Jack confirmed, bringing Ghost to a halt with a quiet word. The colt stood calmly, no longer the terrified, aggressive creature that had cowered in the back pen 2 months ago. "What's your secret?" Luther asked, genuine curiosity in his weathered face. Jack thought about the long morning sitting in the stall, the patient hours of just being present without demanding anything, the way he had learned to read the subtle shifts in Ghost's body language that signaled fear or trust or curiosity. "No secret," he said finally. "Just time and respect. Everyone else wanted to force him. I just let him decide." Luther nodded slowly, his experienced eyes studying the colt with new appreciation. "You know, there's a fellow up in Austin, name of William Marshall. He's building up a breeding program looking for quality stock. He's got more money than sense, and he's particular about bloodlines." If you could prove that horse has decent breeding, despite the color, you might have something valuable. The seed Luther planted that day took root in Jack's mind. Proving Ghost's bloodlines meant finding out where the colt had come from, who had bred it, why an animal with obvious quality had ended up in a county auction marked as defective. It meant research, inquiries, possibly even travel to track down records. It also meant hope, the possibility that his $3 gamble might actually pay off. That evening, Jack wrote his first letter in months, addressing it to the auction house in Henderson County. He asked about the seller of the white colt, any information they could provide about its origins. The letter took him 3 attempts to get right, his writing skills rusty from disuse. But finally, he sealed it with a drop of wax and set it aside to mail when he next went to town. Training intensified over the following weeks. Ghost proved to be a quick learner once trust was established, picking up commands with an intelligence that surprised even Jack. The colt's sensitivity to light remained a challenge, requiring them to work primarily in early morning and late evening when the sun was less intense. But that sensitivity came with an unexpected advantage. Ghost's other senses seemed heightened to compensate, its hearing so acute it could detect approaching riders minutes before Jack heard anything, its spatial awareness so precise it could navigate the corral in near darkness without missing a step. By September, Jack was riding Ghost regularly, starting with short sessions that gradually lengthened as the colt's strength and confidence grew. The animal had filled out considerably, its body developing the powerful musculature that hinted at speed and endurance. The sparse grass and limited feed had not been ideal, but Ghost had thrived regardless, as if determined to prove all the naysayers wrong. One morning, as Jack was saddling Ghost for their daily ride, he noticed a rider approaching from the direction of town. As the figure grew closer, Jack recognized Tommy Jensen, the teenage son of the postmaster. The boy was waving something in his hand, his excitement visible even from a distance. "Mr. Thornton," Tommy called as he reined in his horse. "Letter for you from the auction house. Pa said it looked important, so I rode out special to deliver it." Jack's hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope, worn from its journey but sealed and intact. He thanked Tommy, pressed one of his last coins into the boy's hand despite his protest, and waited until the young rider had departed before opening it. The letter inside was brief, but contained information that made Jack's heart race with possibilities he had not dared to imagine. The letter was written in a clerk's precise hand, but the information it contained was anything but clinical. The white colt had been consigned to the auction by a man named Douglas Crawford, owner of a breeding operation outside of San Antonio. Crawford had a reputation for producing quality horses, commanding premium prices for his stock. The fact that he had sent this particular colt to a county auction, rather than selling it privately or keeping it for his own program, suggested something significant. Jack read the letter 3 times, memorizing every detail. The clerk had included Crawford's address and added a note that the breeder had seemed relieved to be rid of the animal, citing its color as unmarketable despite excellent bloodlines. That final phrase, excellent bloodlines, sang in Jack's mind like a promise. If he could prove Ghost's lineage, if he could demonstrate that the colt came from quality stock, the color that everyone saw as a curse might become merely an unusual characteristic rather than a fatal flaw. But proving bloodlines required documentation, and that meant traveling to San Antonio to confront Crawford directly. The journey would take at least 3 days each way, require money for supplies and lodging that Jack did not have, and leave the ranch unattended for nearly a week. It was risky, possibly foolish, but it was also the only path forward that offered real hope of transforming Ghost from a $3 gamble into something valuable. Jack spent that evening going through his father's belongings, searching for anything he could sell to finance the trip. He found his mother's silver locket, the one possession of hers that his father had kept after her death from fever when Jack was 5. The locket contained a tiny portrait of her, faded but still visible, and holding it made Jack's chest ache with memories he could barely grasp. She had died too young, left his father too soon, and now Jack was contemplating selling the last physical reminder of her existence. He set the locket aside and continued searching, finding his father's pocket watch, tarnished but functional, and an old rifle that still worked despite its age. Together, these items might bring $20, maybe $25 if he found the right buyer. It was enough for the journey to San Antonio, barely, with nothing left over for emergencies or setbacks. It meant betting everything on a single desperate play, risking the small security he had managed to maintain for the possibility of something better. That night, Jack sat on his crooked porch with his father's journal open on his lap, reading by lamplight. One entry from 10 years ago caught his attention. William Thornton had written about a breeding decision that everyone advised against, choosing an unproven mare over safer, more conventional options. The gamble had paid off, producing a foal that became one of the best horses his father ever owned. Sometimes, William had written, the only way forward is to bet on potential rather than proven results. The safe choice keeps you where you are. The brave choice might lift you up or drag you down, but at least you move. The words felt like a message across time, his father speaking to him through ink and paper, encouraging him to take the risk that might change everything. Jack closed the journal and looked toward the barn where Ghost was resting. In 4 months, the colt had transformed from a terrified, aggressive animal into a willing partner with obvious potential. That transformation was real, regardless of what bloodline documentation might prove. But in a world that measured worth in dollars and pedigrees, potential needed proof to become valuable. The next morning, Jack rode into town with the locket, pocket watch, and rifle wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The general store owner, a pragmatic man named Harrison who had known Jack's father, examined each item with the practiced eye of someone who had bought and sold countless desperate possessions over the years. He offered $15 for all three. Take it or leave it. Jack negotiated up to $18, knowing he was still being cheated but having no leverage to demand better. With the money in his pocket, Jack made arrangements with Luther Hawkins to check on the ranch and feed Ghost while he was gone. Luther agreed readily, his curiosity about the colt's bloodlines as sharp as Jack's own. If that animal really does come from Crawford's operation, Luther said thoughtfully, you might have stumbled onto something special. Crawford doesn't breed junk even if he can't sell it. The journey to San Antonio began at dawn 2 days later. Jack rode Sadie, his old mare, leaving Ghost at the ranch where the colt would be safe and cared for. The separation felt wrong somehow, as if he was abandoning a partner just when their partnership was solidifying. But taking Ghost on a week-long journey through unfamiliar territory seemed too risky, especially with the colt's sensitivity to sunlight. The first day passed uneventfully, mile after dusty mile of Texas landscape rolling past. Jack camped that night beside a creek, eating jerky and hardtack while Sadie grazed nearby. He thought about Ghost, wondered if the colt missed him, if the animal understood that he was coming back. The bond they had formed felt fragile still, built on patient repetition and mutual trust, rather than the deep connection that came from years together. The second day brought him into more populated territory, passing through small towns and larger ranches where prosperity showed in painted buildings and fat livestock. Each comfortable homestead reminded Jack of how far the Thornton place had fallen, how close he was to losing everything his family had built across 3 generations. The $18 in his pocket felt simultaneously like a fortune and like nothing at all. Insufficient for the task ahead, but all he had to work with. San Antonio emerged on the horizon late in the afternoon of the 3rd day, a sprawling collection of buildings that seemed impossibly large to Jack's rural eyes. He had been to the city once before as a boy traveling with his father to sell cattle, and he remembered feeling overwhelmed by the noise and crowds and endless motion. Now, riding in alone with a desperate mission, that feeling of being overwhelmed intensified into something close to panic. He found lodging at a cheap boarding house on the outskirts of town, paying for 2 nights and hoping that would be enough time to track down Crawford and obtain whatever documentation existed about Ghost's lineage. The room was small and bare, but it had a bed and a door that locked, which was more than he had expected for the price. Douglas Crawford's breeding operation sat on 200 acres of prime land south of San Antonio, announced by a hand-carved wooden sign that read Crawford Bloodstock in elegant script. Jack rode through the entrance gate feeling acutely aware of how he must appear to anyone watching. His clothes were worn and dusty from travel, his hat sweat-stained and shapeless, his mare plodding along with the resigned gait of an animal that had seen better days. He was poverty approaching prosperity, desperation seeking audience with success. The main house was a sprawling structure of whitewashed wood with a wide veranda wrapped around 3 sides. Beyond it stretched pristine paddocks, where horses grazed on grass so green it looked artificial against the brown Texas landscape. Jack counted at least 20 animals, each one groomed to perfection, each one worth more than everything he owned combined. This was what a successful horse breeding operation looked like, the dream his father had chased and never caught. A stable hand intercepted him before he reached the house, a young Mexican man with suspicious eyes and a protective stance. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Crawford," Jack said, dismounting and holding Sadie's reins. "I have questions about a colt he sold at auction 4 months ago." The stable hand's expression shifted from suspicion to understanding, then to something that looked almost like pity. "The white one?" "Yes, the albino." "Wait here." The young man disappeared into the house, leaving Jack standing in the yard feeling exposed and out of place. He used the time to study the horses in the nearby paddock, noting their conformation and bearing. These were quality animals, confirmation that whatever bloodlines Ghost carried, they came from serious breeding stock. The man who emerged from the house 10 minutes later was in his late 50s, tall and lean with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. Douglas Crawford wore expensive clothes worn casually, the kind of wealth that did not need to announce itself. His eyes assessed Jack in a single sweeping glance, cataloging everything from his worn boots to his calloused hands to the determination in his face. "You're here about the albino colt," Crawford said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. I bought him at the Henderson County auction. I'm trying to verify his bloodlines." Crawford's expression hardened. "That animal has no bloodlines worth verifying. The color makes it worthless for breeding purposes. I thought I made that clear when I consigned it." "With respect, sir, color doesn't change genetics. If the parents were quality horses, the colt carries those genes regardless of coat color." For a moment, Crawford just stared at him, and Jack wondered if he had overstepped, if his desperation had made him too bold. Then something shifted in the older man's face, a crack in the professional facade revealing unexpected emotion beneath. "Come inside," Crawford said abruptly. "If you've traveled all this way, you deserve to hear the whole story." The house's interior matched its exterior, tasteful and expensive without being ostentatious. Crawford led Jack to a study lined with books and framed photographs of horses, champions by the look of them, animals that had won races and sired dynasties. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking if Jack drank, handing one over before settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than Jack's entire ranch. "The colt's sire was Midnight Dancer," Crawford began, his voice carrying the weight of painful memory. "Best stallion I ever owned. Descended from imported Arabian bloodlines on his mother's side, quarter horse speed on his father's. He could run like the wind and had the temperament of a gentleman. Sold his offspring for premium prices to buyers across 3 states. Jack leaned forward, his untouched whiskey forgotten. And the dam? Morning Star, a mare I bought from a breeder in Kentucky. Impeccable lineage, perfect conformation. I bred them specifically to produce a foal that would be the crown jewel of my operation. Crawford took a long drink, his eyes distant. When the colt was born white, I thought it was a trick of the lamplight. By morning, I knew the truth. Albino, pink eyes, sensitive skin, everything that makes a horse unmarketable in this business. But the bloodlines, Jack pressed. They're still there. The genetics don't lie. Crawford's laugh was bitter. You think I haven't tried that argument? I contacted every breeder I knew, offered the colt at a fraction of what his lineage should command. Every single one turned me down, said they couldn't risk the albino gene contaminating their breeding programs, said their buyers would never accept it, said it didn't matter what the parents were if the offspring was cursed. Jack felt his stomach tighten. Cursed? Superstition runs deep in horse breeding. Albinos are considered bad luck, weak, short-lived. Most of it is nonsense, but perception is reality in this business. I kept that colt for 6 months, hoping someone would see past the color. Finally accepted that it was never going to happen and sent him to auction just to be rid of the reminder of my failed breeding plan. The study fell silent except for the ticking of an ornate clock on the mantel. Jack stared at his whiskey glass, watching the amber liquid catch the afternoon light filtering through the windows. He had come seeking proof of value, validation for his $3 gamble. Instead, he had found confirmation that Ghost was worth exactly what people believed: nothing. How much did you pay for him? Crawford asked quietly. $3. Crawford closed his eyes briefly. Christ, I'm sorry, that's what it's come to, is it? Midnight dancer's son selling for the price of a good meal. He saved my life, Jack said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. A rattlesnake would have bitten me for sure. Ghost killed it, put himself between me and danger without hesitation. And he's smart, learns faster than any horse I've ever worked with. The sun bothers his eyes, but he's not weak, he's not cursed, he's just different. Crawford studied him with new interest. Ghost, you named him? Seemed to fit. The older man rose and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner, pulling out a folder that he laid on the desk between them. Inside were documents, pedigree charts stretching back 5 generations, breeding records, veterinary reports, the paper trail of Ghost's lineage, proof that defied the prejudice that had made the colt worthless. These are yours, Crawford said. Consider them payment for giving that animal something I couldn't, a chance. The bloodlines are impeccable. Everything I told you is documented here. Whether anyone will care once they see the color is another question entirely. Jack gathered the papers with trembling hands, unable to believe what was being offered. Why? Why give me this? Because you're the first person who's asked about that colt, as if he matters, rather than as if he's a curiosity or a mistake. Crawford refilled his whiskey glass, his expression weary. I've bred horses for 35 years, built this operation from nothing, earned a reputation for quality that opens doors across the country, and I couldn't see past the color of a single foal to recognize that bloodlines matter more than appearance. You did. That makes you wiser than me, even if you're poorer. As Jack prepared to leave, Crawford walked him to the door, pausing on the veranda. There's one more thing you should know. Midnight Dancer died 3 months ago. Colic. Ghost is his last living offspring. The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. Ghost was not just a well-bred horse with unfortunate coloring. He was the last son of a champion stallion, the final genetic legacy of an animal that had established Crawford's reputation across 3 states. The pedigree papers Jack carried suddenly felt heavier, weighted with a responsibility he had not anticipated. This was no longer just about saving his ranch or proving his $3 gamble was sound. This was about preserving something irreplaceable. The journey back to the ranch passed in a blur of anticipation and planning. Jack rode harder than he should have, pushing Sadie beyond what was wise for a mare her age, driven by an urgency to return to Ghost and begin the next phase of their partnership. The pedigree documents stayed wrapped in oilcloth and tucked securely in his saddlebag, checked compulsively every few hours to ensure they remained safe and dry. He arrived home on the evening of the 6th day, exhausted and saddle-sore but electric with purpose. Luther Hawkins was at the barn when Jack rode in, and the relief on the older man's face was evident. "Thought you might have gotten yourself into trouble in the city," Luther said. "Ghost has been restless without you." Smart Animal knew something was different. Jack barely heard him, already moving toward the barn where Ghost stood in the paddock, illuminated by the last rays of sunset. The colt's white coat seemed to glow in the golden light, and when those pink eyes found Jack across the distance, the animal released a sound that was part whinny, part greeting, part accusation for the absence. Jack climbed the fence, and Ghost came to him immediately, pressing his broad forehead against Jack's chest in a gesture that spoke of relief and reunion. "I found it," Jack whispered into the colt's mane. "Proof of what you really are. Your father was a champion, Ghost. You're not a mistake or a curse, you're legacy." Over the next week, Jack began the careful process of introducing Ghost's true lineage to the ranching community. He started with Luther, showing him the pedigree documents by lamplight in the Thornton kitchen. Luther studied each page with growing amazement, his weathered finger tracing bloodlines that read like a who's who of quality horse breeding. "If this is real," Luther said slowly, "and I've no reason to think it's not with Crawford's signature on it, then you're sitting on something valuable. Not despite the color, but maybe even because of it. Midnight Dancer's last son, that's a story people will pay attention to." "Will they, though?" Jack asked, voicing the fear that had haunted him since leaving San Antonio. Crawford couldn't sell him. Every breeder he contacted turned him down because of superstition about albinos. Luther nodded thoughtfully. Crawford was trying to sell to breeders, people looking to build their own operations. They're conservative, risk-averse. But there's another market. Wealthy men who want unique horses, animals that stand out. A white horse with champion bloodlines. That's not a liability to them. That's an attraction. The observation planted a seed in Jack's mind. He had been thinking about Ghost in terms of breeding value, following the same path Crawford had tried and failed. But Luther was right. Ghost's uniqueness, properly presented to the right buyer, could transform a perceived weakness into a coveted characteristic. The challenge was finding that right buyer and convincing them that Ghost was worth serious money. Jack had no connections to wealthy collectors, no network of potential clients, no reputation that would open doors. What he did have was a horse that was growing more impressive by the day, and documentation that proved the animal's worth to anyone willing to look past the color. Training intensified with renewed purpose. Jack worked Ghost every morning and evening, refining the colt's responses, building stamina and speed, proving that the genetics carried in those pedigree papers translated into real-world performance. Ghost proved eager to learn, seeming to sense that something important was happening, that their partnership was building towards something significant. By October, Ghost had filled out into a magnificent young stallion, his unusual coloring offset by perfect conformation and powerful movement. His sensitivity to bright sunlight remained, but Jack had learned to work with it rather than against it, scheduling training for dawn and dusk when the light was softer. In those conditions, Ghost moved like poetry, his white coat catching the golden light in ways that made even casual observers stop and stare. Word began to spread beyond the immediate community. A horse trader passing through stopped at the ranch to see the albino everyone was talking about and left impressed despite his initial skepticism. A rancher from 2 counties over made a special trip after hearing about Midnight Dancer's last son, offering $500 on the spot. Jack turned him down, not out of greed, but from a growing certainty that Ghost was worth far more to the right buyer. Marcus Hadley rode out again in early November, his manner less condescending than during his first visit. "Heard you went all the way to San Antonio to track down that colt's breeding," Hadley said, watching Ghost work in the corral. "Heard you've got papers proving he's out of Crawford's best stallion." "Midnight Dancer," Jack confirmed, bringing Ghost to a halt with a quiet word. "Impeccable bloodlines on both sides. The color is just a genetic variation, doesn't affect ability or temperament." Hadley studied the horse with a horseman's practiced eye, noting the powerful hindquarters, the deep chest, the intelligent eyes. "I'll give you $1,000 for him. That's more than fair for an unproven yearling, color notwithstanding." $1,000. 6 months ago, it would have been unimaginable wealth. Now, with Ghost's true value becoming clearer each day, it felt like an insult. "He's not for sale," Jack said. "Not yet." "Pride's expensive, Thornton," Hadley warned. "That offer won't stand forever. Winter's coming, and you're still broke from what I can see. $1,000 could change your life." After Hadley left, Jack stood in the corral with Ghost, running his hands over the smooth white coat while wrestling with doubt. $1,000 would save the ranch, buy supplies and breeding stock, provide security he had never known. It was the practical choice, the sensible choice. But there was something in the way Ghost looked at him, in the partnership they had built, that suggested waiting for the right opportunity rather than accepting the first adequate one. The answer came 2 weeks later in the form of a letter forwarded from Luther Hawkins. William Marshall, the wealthy Austin businessman Luther had mentioned months ago, had heard about Ghost through the ranching grapevine. He was coming to see the white stallion personally, and he was bringing enough money to make a serious offer if the horse lived up to its reputation. The meeting was scheduled for the first week of December, giving Jack 1 month to prepare Ghost for the most important evaluation of both their lives. The month before William Marshall's visit passed in a fever of preparation. Jack worked Ghost with an intensity born of desperation and hope, refining every aspect of the stallion's training until their partnership moved beyond mere competence into something approaching art. Ghost responded to the challenge with an enthusiasm that suggested he understood the stakes, his intelligence making him not just a willing student, but an active participant in his own development. Jack spent his last few dollars on supplies to improve the ranch's appearance. He patched the worst holes in the barn, straightened fence posts that had listed for years, cleared weeds from around the house. It was superficial work, cosmetic changes that did nothing to address the fundamental poverty of the place, but he needed William Marshall to see potential rather than failure when he arrived. The ranch had to look like a place where quality horses could be developed, not like the desperate last stand it actually was. The work left him exhausted and hungry, surviving on short rations to stretch his dwindling supplies until Marshall's visit. Ghost fared better, Jack making sure the stallion had adequate feed even if it meant he himself went without. The colt's condition was critical to their success, and Jack would starve before he let Ghost suffer from inadequate nutrition. Luther stopped by regularly during those weeks, offering advice and occasionally bringing supplies he claimed were surplus from his own ranch. Jack suspected charity, but accepted gratefully, pride being a luxury he could no longer afford. Together they strategized about how to present Ghost, what aspects of his training to demonstrate, how to frame the albino coloring as unique rather than defective. "Marshall's a businessman," Luther said one evening as they watched Ghost graze in the twilight. "He's made his fortune in railroads and real estate, but horses are his passion. He's got money to burn and a desire to own something nobody else has. Ghost fits that description perfectly." "What if he's like all the others?" Jack asked, voicing his deepest fear. "What if he takes one look at the color and walks away?" Luther was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Then you've still got a magnificent horse that's proven everyone wrong about albinos. That's worth something, even if Marshall can't see it. But I think he will. I think he's coming because the story of Midnight Dancer's last son intrigues him enough to look past the prejudice. The day of Marshall's visit arrived cold and clear, the December sky a brilliant blue that made Ghost's white coat gleam like polished marble. Jack had been awake since before dawn, grooming the stallion until every hair lay perfectly, checking and rechecking tack, rehearsing in his mind the demonstration he had planned. His hands shook as he worked, not from cold, but from the knowledge that everything depended on the next few hours. William Marshall arrived precisely at noon in a carriage pulled by matched bays that probably cost more than Jack's entire property. The man who emerged was in his early 50s, impeccably dressed in city clothes that looked absurd in the rural setting, but perfectly suited to his bearing. He had the confidence of someone accustomed to being the wealthiest man in any room, but his eyes, when they found Ghost, were those of a true horseman, knowledgeable and discerning. "Mr. Thornton," Marshall said, extending a hand that bore the softness of a man who worked with his mind rather than his back. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I've heard remarkable things about your white stallion." Jack shook the offered hand, acutely aware of his own calluses and rough skin. "Thank you for making the trip, Mr. Marshall. I think you'll find Ghost exceeds his reputation." Marshall walked a slow circle around Ghost, who stood ground-tied in the yard, his manner calm despite the stranger's scrutiny. The businessman's expression remained neutral, professional, giving nothing away about his thoughts. He examined the stallion from every angle, occasionally reaching out to touch, checking confirmation with practiced hands. Finally, he stepped back and looked at Jack directly. "The papers Luther showed me, they're authentic?" "Yes, sir. Douglas Crawford signed them himself. Everything's documented back 5 generations on both sides. And Crawford really couldn't sell him because of the color." "Yes, sir. Every breeder he contacted turned him down, said the albino gene was too risky for their programs." Marshall smiled thinly. The fools. They looked at the surface and missed what lay beneath. Classic mistake in business and in horses. He turned back to Ghost, his expression shifting to something like hunger. "I want to see him move, not just walk. I want to see what he can really do." This was the moment Jack had prepared for. He swung into the saddle, feeling Ghost's familiar strength beneath him, and guided the stallion toward the open pasture beyond the corral. What followed was not just a demonstration of training, but a revelation of partnership. Jack put Ghost through paces that showcased the stallion's speed, his responsiveness, his intelligence. They moved together as one entity, horse and rider reading each other with a precision that transcended mere command and obedience. Ghost ran like he had been born for it, his powerful legs eating up the ground in long, smooth strides. His white coat became a blur of motion, and Jack felt that familiar surge of joy that came from riding an animal that loved to run. They made wide circles around the pasture, changing pace from canter to gallop and back, demonstrating control and power in equal measure. When they finally returned to where Marshall stood watching, both Jack and Ghost were breathing hard, flushed with exertion and the satisfaction of a performance perfectly executed. Marshall's neutral expression had transformed into something approaching awe, and Jack felt hope bloom in his chest for the first time since deciding to make this gamble. "Remarkable," Marshall said quietly. "Absolutely remarkable. That's not just good breeding, Mr. Thornton. That's extraordinary training and genuine partnership. How old is he?" "Just over a year, 14 months. And you bought him for $3 at a county auction?" "Yes, sir. Everyone else thought he was defective because of the color. I thought he was worth a chance." Marshall was silent for a long moment, studying both Jack and Ghost with calculating eyes. Then he named a figure that made Jack's knees go weak. $5,000. That's my offer. It's more than fair for an unproven yearling, but that performance justifies it. With proper continued training and care, Ghost could become something legendary. $5,000. The words echoed in Jack's mind like a bell tolling the end of poverty, the end of struggle, the end of everything that had defined his life since his father's death. With that money, he could pay off every debt, rebuild the ranch into something substantial, buy breeding stock and equipment, transform the Thornton place from a failing homestead into a viable operation. It was everything he had dreamed of when he spent his last $3 on a supposedly cursed colt. And yet, standing there with his hand resting on Ghost's neck, feeling the stallion's warmth and the rise and fall of his breathing, Jack felt something unexpected. Hesitation. This animal had saved his life, had trusted him when trust had been beaten out of him by rough handlers, had become more than just a horse but a partner in the truest sense. Selling Ghost, even for a fortune, felt like betrayal. "That's an incredibly generous offer, Mr. Marshall," Jack said slowly, his throat tight. "Can I ask what you plan to do with him?" Marshall's expression shifted, revealing a shrewdness that had probably built his business empire. "I have a stable in Austin, finest facility in Texas. Ghost would receive the best care, professional training, everything money can buy. I'm building a collection of unique horses, animals that stand out. He'd be the centerpiece." "Would you breed him?" Jack pressed, thinking of Crawford's words about Ghost being Midnight Dancer's last living offspring. "Eventually, perhaps, though the albino gene is unpredictable. I'm primarily interested in him as a riding horse, something extraordinary for my personal use." There it was. Marshall saw Ghost as a possession, a unique item to add to a collection. He would provide excellent care, certainly better than Jack could afford on his failing ranch. But he would never see Ghost as a partner, never understand the bond they had built through patience and mutual trust. The stallion would become another beautiful object owned by a wealthy man, his genetic legacy potentially ending with him if Marshall decided breeding was too risky. Jack looked at Ghost, really looked at him. The stallion stood calmly, his pink eyes watching Jack with that intelligent gaze that had first convinced him this was no ordinary horse. In 14 months, they had both been transformed. Ghost had gone from a terrified, aggressive animal to a confident, willing partner. Jack had gone from a broke, desperate young man to someone capable of developing extraordinary potential when others saw only problems. "Mr. Marshall," Jack heard himself say, the words coming from some place deeper than conscious thought. "I appreciate your offer more than you know, but I can't sell him." Marshall's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Can't or won't?" "Won't," Jack admitted. "Ghost isn't just a horse to me. He's proof that my father was right about looking past the surface to see real value. And he's Midnight Dancer's last son. That means something." "I could go higher," Marshall said, his tone shifting to negotiation. 7,000. That's more than most proven stallions command." $7,000. Jack felt the weight of that number, the security it represented, the future it could buy. His father had died broke after a lifetime of chasing dreams that never materialized. Was Jack about to repeat that mistake, turning down guaranteed wealth for sentimental attachment to a horse? But then he thought about his father's journal, about the entry that had encouraged him to bet on potential rather than proven results. William Thornton had died poor in terms of money, but rich in the belief that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the profitable thing. That belief was the true inheritance, more valuable than land or livestock. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marshall, the answer is still no." Marshall studied him for a long moment, then surprised Jack by smiling. "You're either a fool or a visionary, Thornton. Time will tell which." He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it over. "If you ever change your mind, contact me. That offer stands indefinitely. And if you ever need support for a breeding program, I know investors who might be interested in backing Midnight Dancer's last son." After Marshall's carriage disappeared down the rutted track, Luther rode up, having watched the entire exchange from a respectful distance. "You turned him down," he said, not quite a question. "I did. You know what you're giving up? That money could have set you up for life." Jack nodded, still processing his own decision. "I know. But Luther, what if Ghost is meant for more than being someone's prized possession? What if his real value is in proving that bloodlines matter more than appearance, and showing that albinos can be just as strong and capable as any other horse? If I sell him now, that story ends. But if I keep him, if I breed him carefully and prove his offspring inherit his quality, that could change how people think about genetics and color." Luther was quiet for a moment, then laughed softly. "Your father would be proud, or horrified. Possibly both." He paused, then added, "I know some mare owners who might be willing to take a chance on breeding to an albino if you're serious about this." That conversation was the beginning of something extraordinary. Over the next 2 years, Jack built a modest breeding program around Ghost, carefully selecting mares with complementary bloodlines. The first foals that arrived bore out his belief. Not all were albino, and those that were showed the same sensitivity to light as their father, but every single one carried the speed, intelligence, and magnificent conformation of Midnight Dancer's line. Word spread through the ranching community about the quality of Ghost's offspring. Buyers who would never have considered an albino stallion found themselves drawn to the proven results. Jack began commanding premium prices for foals, then for breeding rights, then for training services as ranchers sought to replicate the partnership he had built with Ghost. By the time Jack turned 30, the Thornton Ranch had been transformed. New barns stood straight and solid, pastures were lush and well-maintained, and a sign at the entrance read, "Thornton Bloodstock, established 1887. Jack had married a rancher's daughter who loved horses as much as he did, and their first son had been born the previous spring. They named him William, after Jack's father, and the boy's first word was Ghost. The albino stallion lived to the age of 23, far exceeding the predictions of those who claimed white horses were weak and short-lived. He sired over 100 foals, establishing a bloodline that became known across Texas and beyond. Some inherited his unique coloring, others did not, but all carried his intelligence, speed, and gentle temperament. When Ghost finally passed, Jack buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, next to his father. The headstone read simply, "Ghost, Midnight Dancer's last son, who proved that value lies not in appearance but in heart." Below that, Jack added his father's words, "Sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as problems that scare everyone else away." Standing at the grave years later, Jack's own hair now streaked with silver, he thought about that day at the Henderson County auction when he had counted his last $3 and gambled them on a supposedly defective colt. Everyone had said he was foolish, that albinos were cursed, that he was throwing good money after bad. They had been wrong about Ghost, and in being wrong, they had given Jack the opportunity to become the richest rancher in Texas, not in spite of the $3 colt, but because of him. The white horses of the Thornton bloodline became legendary, sought after across the country, their value measured not just in dollars, but in the revolution they represented. Jack had proven that prejudice and superstition were poor judges of worth, that patience and belief could transform rejection into legacy, and every time he saw one of Ghost's descendants, their coats gleaming white in the Texas sun, he remembered the terrified colt in the back pen who had needed only one thing that everyone else had refused to give him: a chance.